a decent amount of people on stage. Welcome back. So when it comes to GDPR, I was wondering who is working on projects here in the audience that come across issues in GDPR. What? Okay. So then you must have a burning question. Sorry? One of the questions had... But perhaps you have a follow-up question.
Well, thanks for the presentation. I found it very, very clear, and I learned a lot. In my work, I work with contact data from B2B, and of course GDPR is slamming us. But the thing about the immutability of the blockchain, thank you for letting me know that actually that is not really how you should approach the question. So I actually don't have a real question, but
you didn't want to.
You're first.
Okay. Your work. So if you talk about that immutability not being a problem or so, or do you consider it a feature still or an issue? Because, of course, the initial thought is that immutability or intemperability is one of the core features. We kind of had that before blockchain already, but now it's out in the open and public. What if there are certain patents which enable, which are meant to enable you to delete stuff from blockchains. How do you cope with that? I mean, isn't it meant to be not deletable?
Yeah, so I think it's important. What do you want to be able to always do? You don't always want to be able to have that data or to be able to process the data, but you do always want to be able to verify that the data is actual and the data is real. So the fact that the verification is immutable, that's a positive thing.
All right.
Yeah, but it depends in the end, of course, also about how the way the information gets into the blockchain. Because if there's an error there, you would want it to be mutable in a later stage, right? So if something goes wrong with entering the data, and there is just an error in it from the beginning.
You can overwrite it with a new event.
Yeah, but still the error.
But why does it matter?
Yeah, that depends whether if it's information regarding a data subject that could be
date of birth.
Yeah, character relevant. Yeah.
But I actually think that might be it still has to be decided on. But I also agree that if there's information and it's incorrect, and you add another information, it doesn't. I don't think it's possible to override, but it will be added. But at least you
basically connect one asset to the other, and you say other asset is not.
Yeah. So then
information is irrelevant.
But it's still there, factually. The information.
Why does that specifically matter? That it's okay. If it's birth date, then it doesn't really matter. But if it's a certain.
Yeah. Well, actually, I agree that it would be. Personally, I agree that it may, in a lot of cases, not matter, but it still needs to be decided upon because it's not. Yeah, what actually constitutes erasure, I think. But I'm quite sure that there might be a lot of possibilities to find.
Yeah, I think immutability shouldn't be. It's a feature, to answer your question, and shouldn't be compromised by any workarounds. And
so you should really look at the purpose.
And I was just having a conversation now in between the presentation and the Q&A, and I said that we should keep the blockchain principles behind the blockchain immuted. So we shouldn't compromise on those. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to use the blockchain in the first place.
What I maybe would like to add, if you look at Bitcoin, for example, the reason why consensus is working is due to the fact that the data on the blockchain is immutable and it can be trusted. So that's a bit of a takeaway, is the data should be trusted in order to reach upon consensus. So maybe you should think like, what data do I put on the blockchain that adds value to the network itself, and keep the rest outside of the network.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's also important if you go to that part where you say, hey, it's a problem that I can put something on and then maybe do another transaction for correction. If that's already a problem, you've probably already gone a step too far and already put too sensitive data on the chain.
So we've talked about this before in the preparations. Of course, the sensitive information in a B2B environment is not privacy protected, but there's a huge need for keeping it a secret. Do you think the same principles would apply in that way? For example, if you look at supply chain solutions where you don't want others to know what the volumes are or stuff like that, do you think that GDPR could be an inspiration for these kind of keeping secrets from each other but still being able to collaborate?
I think if you look at the concept of data attestations or proofs, then you can still keep certain information as a secret, but you can let them know that it's true. So you basically provide a proof that something happened, but you don't know, but cryptographically you can trust it. That's what I say as a technology nerd maybe. And that's definitely a solution where you can keep stuff private, have a proof. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, you know, when you look at GDPR, it's really about protecting the individuals. And you can expect if two big corporations are working together, they can kind of battle it out by themselves. But if you have a huge corporation and then have a small or mid-sized companies, they're just as vulnerable probably as the individuals. So really, even though the law doesn't stipulate that it should also be applied to corporations, it would really be good if you would also take it into account for especially dealing with small and mid-sized companies.
Yeah, and how about freelancers then?
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Are freelancers considered a business or a private person? How is that? How are they protected?
Actually, I think the test should not be what kind of companies are. It should always be, does it involve personal data? Because there can also be people working at companies.
Okay.
So then, yeah.
That's kind of the same. Yeah.
Yeah, but there is, of course, there is a distinction between personal data and another kind of know-how that needs to be kept a secret.
Yeah.
Of course.
But you could take the same approach in protecting that. I don't think it's necessary because then you don't have to meet up with all the requirements that are in the GDPR. And it's more a responsibility of the know-how owner itself, whether or not he wants to disclose it.
Yeah.
But you could use the same techniques, of course, to protect them in a blockchain.
Okay. I have a mic.
I have some interesting thoughts. My name is Loyens Loeff. I work for ING, but I also, as a student now in a masterclass, I've done some literature review on AI. I see the similar things, but first I want to start. I've done MiFID II for ING, which is European law also on for transactions. You have to be really transparent. And there you can see that MiFID II is actually, with GDPR, are actually they're on 90 degrees on each other. They really contradict each other.
Okay.
So what you can see is that for European law, which is a directive, MiFID, and also GDPR, they haven't thought about this. And also I was talking to her as well, is that within the law, I think what just saw in review is that the law is not ready to be seen as an algorithm that goes wrong, because we do look at an entity with persons. And when someone writes an algorithm, who is actually in charge for this algorithm? Like we heard in the UK, there's a senior management act that if something goes wrong, they are reliable. And also in German law, you see that people are liable now on private law. So I think the law is just looking a 10-year gap, I would say, behind all these things. So what we saw in literature review is that you need to have control frameworks that you can actually, as a community, should advise, I think, the regulators. And also what I would say is have consultations with the regulators. Mm-hmm. But that's something you need from a community, I think, to actually start somewhere, because stating it's not working is not enough, I think. You need to really work with them closely. And that's what I see in a lot of directives, that you need to work closely with DNP and AFM and all kinds of things. That I think is a good start, but there needs a lot to be done. Yeah. Because we saw as well in AI that the red button or the rules to be forgotten, yeah, it's in database in big corporates. It's not done because we have like 60 interfaces in systems that are manual supported and maintained.
And can you perhaps name one example where the legislations contradict? And then I want to continue.
Yeah,
to
MiFID
maybe a
II.
question.
MiFID II, we have to give privacy data for algorithms and persons, national IDs, to the venues we work with, so London Stock Exchange and Euronext, for example. Mm-hmm. And GDPR wants us to delete those data. So actually, in one case, algorithms, they need to know who is actually executing these trades on the exchanges, and GDPR wants us to delete them.
Sounds like an interesting case for decentralization. I mean, if you step out of the middle there as a bank, then probably it could work. But okay. Question here.
So are you trying to make a point here? No.
Work? Can you hear? Yeah. So I might have a short question for all of you, and that would be sort of where is the limit between a small group of individuals and a larger group which can be sort of like generalized and which might no longer be considered identifiable individually, specifically. GDPR could be considered like a special case or use of a more general concept like Chatham House rules, where when you have a small number of people in the room and you agree that you will not share about anything that an individual said or who said it, specifically, then you can say that if there's a sufficient number of people in the room, then you can speak freely about whatever was said. But if there was a small number of people, then you have to be really careful about sort of like sharing the information with anybody outside. And when you look at a specific example, for example, with LinkedIn, when you have when there's a job open position on LinkedIn, LinkedIn provides statistics only when there's more than 10 people applying for that job. So I was wondering, can you sort of like think about some examples you've maybe seen in your experience where there would be a sort of like a boundary or like a limit where when the number of people involved is larger than that number, than that limit, it could be considered like a group which can be sort of like freely processed, for example, in blockchain or decentralized ledgers. And when the number of those individuals is lower than the limit, then they shouldn't be sort of like grouped together and processed in a sort of like a transparent way. Maybe to give you a specific question or application I have in mind is I'm from the utility industry, and the utility industry is looking into aggregating or disaggregating consumption of individual households, individual people, and sometimes the interim solution that is being used in blockchain applications of that kind is to aggregate in a zip code. So you take a small village or small town and you aggregate across that whole town. But what happens if you have 3 addresses, 3 households with a given zip code? Can you sort of like process their data in an open way, or should you try to limit the potential ability of a party or of a third party to disaggregate and to find out specific details of the household consumption for those people? So, sorry for a long question, but maybe sort of like, do you see like where some form of limit between a small group of individuals and a large group of people?
No, actually, no. I think it was a difficult question. I'm not quite sure whether I completely understand you, but if you ask whether there's a difference between a small group or a big group when if the GDPR is applicable or not, no. It's just about the question really is there personal data involved, and is it being processed? And that's the core question, I think, and it doesn't matter how big the group of the persons is.
No,
Instead, if it's your own
this question
household.
was really valid because
I'm not saying it is not valid, but
it's about aggregation. So if you aggregate something of one person, it's pretty much not aggregating. If you're aggregating about 2, it's then already non-identified. But if you aggregate data from 1,000 persons or 10,000,
it's a lot more difficult to single out.
When do you say it's no longer personal data? I think that's a very interesting case.
Yeah,
and actually, I think you were already assessing it really well, because you said, like, well, if you have 3 households that are pretty much the same, it might be easy to lead it back to, like, oh, okay, well, this is these are the ages, this is the zip code, then it must be that household. So you always is always a factual test. That is it possible to factually trace it back to that individual? And I think you always have to assess that by a case-by-case basis. But I think you made the right assessment. But the bar or the limit you were looking for, I think that it depends on the case what the bar is.
Maybe have you seen some of those like cases in other industries, in other cases like where there would be like natural limits or like natural?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So the question would be, have you seen maybe in other industries, in other use cases, some kind of similar thinking which might be applicable? Because, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that we heard it, that if we can sort of see some similarities or some sort of like uses in other instances, it might help the thinking and to sort of the design of the systems.
I cannot really think of because it depends so much on the facts. So you would always have to assess that on a case-by-case basis. How nice it would be to have a rule or standard.
Maybe
No examples yet.
healthcare, that you have a similar example, but I wouldn't come up now. But I can imagine that within healthcare you have clusters of research groups that research certain topics, and in those clusters you shouldn't identify what they're researching. So that could potentially be something that you're aiming for. But my opinion would be you can either solve it in a very difficult way and architect your data structure, or you can wait till certain cryptographic methodologies are implemented, and you can just make sure that the information coming from a smart meter is encrypted and shown as a proof to the other calculation, so that the other calculation can use the outcome of that. And that's an example that you can take.
Okay, what I was wondering, you guys do projects with all these corporates. The whole idea of when Bitcoin started was the sovereignty of the user, right? To own the assets, the data, what have you. In what way are the clients you're working with, and you can say this in a general way, but are they willing to give up their data position, as in still thinking that it is their data, still thinking that data is oil, in order to give back that sovereignty that we actually would need in order to make the whole thing work?
Yeah, I think if you look at it from that case, it's basically their data is also valuable, right? So, and they see maybe they sit on a pot of gold, but the value of that pot of gold can only be extracted if they share it with others. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if we open up data, I cannot give any specific case, sorry, but if we open up the data to other people to let them use the data so they can extract value and bring back value to the certain company, these are the kind of cases where the companies also have right to own their data. So just like me as a Bitcoin owner, I own my Bitcoin, they also own the data, but then they can share it in a safe manner. And then using sort of token mechanisms to incentivize people for sharing and giving out data. And that's, yeah.
Well, I think, in many cases, it's not actually in the best interest of the data owner for the data to be shared and be processed. So I think that's where the friction, is getting from. So in that case, now with the GDPR law, it's kind of forcing the hand of these big corporates to say, okay, we need to give up the position that we had.
And I think that some big corporations are starting to realizing that and going forward. But that also depends on the kind of data they have to give up.
Yeah, and I think also the big corporates would also see it as a relief in a way. I mean, it's like, you know what, you are the owner of your data. This is what, in a way, in a conceptual manner, and I think we might see some implementation of this. Basically, I store all my data on my phone, and then if I share it with someone, I will just lease it under my own conditions. Yeah. These kind of things can work and can take a lot of burden away from the company. So this is the advantage they will see it. Mm-hmm. However, if that interest is bigger than owning the data and doing kind of whatever they want with it, or tricking us to agree on something that is actually not what they're going to do, then yeah, I'm not
Yeah, and I think
I'm not sure.
I think that's also the danger, what you said now, about tricking the user, even with the consensus. There's been tested. People, they give up the data for free coffee. So,
yeah,
it's like you really need to have this, to take this at heart. And if you just say, okay, and how can I work around these rules and trick users? I think you're on the wrong path.
Yep. Yeah, I agree.
Of course,
there should be a solution on. And somehow companies will have to agree on certain rules and the fact that they should respect, again, users. There's going to be a shift, and the blockchain I think is going to play a big part in this.
How would you characterize that shift?
Well, I would like to see people going away from Facebook just as a protest, for instance, to say like, I just lost control over my data. It's scattered all around. I just deleted the entire thing. Give me proof of that, and let's start from zero. But this has to come from the user itself, I think, for companies to then realize how important data is, because we still. If I ask to a friend how much you care about your data, it's like I don't. They would say, I don't have anything to hide, so which is quite a stupid answer. I don't have nothing to hide, so just leave Facebook doing whatever they want. But then if you go a step further of understanding that the data is used to influence you, then you might influence your decision, then you might kind of convince them of that. Yeah. But again, the shift has to come, I think, from us, from citizens.
Yeah, you could ask also if they want to share their electronic healthcare record with Google or Facebook, right?
Yeah, credit cards work well. Yeah. If you tell them that, then they would be like, oh, money, yes, sure. I don't want to share that.
And I think there are also cases where corporates need to share their data in order to maybe let the product be adopted faster. I think if you look at automotive industry, where you have autonomous cars, and these autonomous cars can communicate with certain networks, and the cars have their data and it can be processed and can be learned. Am I the owner of the data from the car that I own, or is it from the automotive company? Yeah. But secondly, also, can I control with who the car is communicating? Or is the automotive company communicating? Or is the automotive company controlling who's communicating with the car? And I think there's a very relevant case if we want to move into an autonomous world where you need to start sharing data with others to foster adoption and make the roads more safe. Because if I don't have the data as a government from cars that are driving on my infrastructure, how do I know it's a safe infrastructure? And there are other examples where Uber in San Francisco didn't want to share their data with the government because they controlled basically all the sort of public transportation lines, because the Ubers were driving on locations where there was no public transport. But they should work together to foster that people can move in the city instead of just keeping their data. But yeah, Uber needs to be incentivized in a certain way to give that data to entities. I think there's a problem of co-opetition where there's a paradox on how can you solve this co-opetition paradox between these companies in order to make society a bit better. It sounds a bit vague, but that's, I think, the problem that's there.
Yeah, okay.
I have another question. Basically, on what I saw is that in other regulations that there's no market practice on how you give consent, because a lot of apps give you scrolling down 20 pages and then you say, I agree. Mm-hmm. And what I heard from other lawyers is that you need to have a contract law. You have to sign a contract to give consent that they can use your data. So even here, what you say, the connectivity of apps and APIs, what is the market practice of connectivity? Because how can you prove that someone is giving you consent? Is that a contract, or is it some
no, it has to be, as long as it is explicit and ambiguous, and you can actually prove it. So you can, if you register, if you click on a button and the system registers and makes it that you can show that the consent has been given, but you don't need a contract in that respect.
One of the challenges of the hackathon will be to create a protocol for digital consent. And it's a government-backed challenge. So then it's interesting to think about that there are certain entities considering to create a centralized form of how to keep track of consent for the consumers of their market. But if you have just an open protocol to legally verify or legally register and communicate digital consent, then you're all done, right?
Especially because you have, you have connectivity. Especially in the IoT, if you have connectivity, the data becomes value when you have a lot of connectivity. If you only have one BlackBerry and it's not connected, then it has no value. But when you connect your BlackBerry then with 20 or 30 other apps, then you have data and more value. So that's even more than interesting to see for all these APIs, how can you prove that they all have given you consent to use it?
Exactly. Yeah, okay, wait, just, I will be back here soon.
We're now talking about what I'm interested in is how does this link to the right to be forgotten? Because if you give consent, then at some point you made a conscious decision to give away the right to a certain amount of data.
Perhaps.
Not fully agree, because you can always withdraw your consent. So it's not like an absolute giving away
Yes,
permission.
but does that pertain to the information that you've already given? Or is it for information that will follow up on that one?
It is from the moment that you withdraw your consent, the controller will not be able to use the consent as a legal basis. But all processing activities that have been performed with your valid consent before the moment it has been withdrawn, that stays the way. So that cannot be.
But if, for instance, you give your name and address to a controller with permission to use it for processing, and then a year later you say, I want to withdraw my permission, you can no longer use my name and address. So all the processing that was done before that day is still valid, but afterwards the controller can no longer use your name and address.
Yeah, that's what I said. Yeah.
Yeah. No, you also have the right to remove it from the database as a data subject. That's the right to erasure.
Yeah, well, I think there's limitation that, I mean, especially with the name and address, if they're sending you invoices and you still own their money,
then you have another basis for your processing, and then you shouldn't build your processing on consent, but on a contract.
No, well, that's. I agree. I agree with you. If you still need it in order to perform a contract, then you can keep. That's only the information that you need in order to perform the contract. Yeah.
But we have perhaps an exception to that.
There's an exception on that.
I think there's an exception to the rule when you do health research, because then the right for the individual is trumped by the right of the community. When you do health research, maybe you can say you lose my number, for instance, but the collected data is part of a larger data set and to further research. There's a huge debate now going whether or not this can be done. Usually you have a consent form when you enter a specific trial, but now the GDPR opens it up to the entire hospital scene. Yes, patient number, and you can lose that information and anonymize it, but in a way you cannot say, lose my complete patient file. But the GDPR does say that you have the right, so there's a huge debate whether or not we are compliant with the GDPR or compliant with at least a research medical facility.
Well, yeah, there are a lot of exceptions. For example, if the controller has a legal obligation to keep the data, there would also be a reason that it's still a valid reason to keep it. Yeah.
So, if you have a contract where you actually sold your data, does GDPR regulation overrule that contract? Or not. So the contract states, okay, you're selling your data and they can use it for that and you cannot withdraw that.
Well, actually, the ownership of data is not really. We see that a lot, but it's not actually ownership of data. It's so you cannot really sell your data. You can grant someone needed the permission to use it for certain purposes.
Okay, yeah, so I granted that, I've received the money, and then under the GDPR regulations, can
You
I
say,
say,
"Oh, no, I
okay,
don't wanna do it anymore."
You know,
Yeah.
you gave me €1,000, but you know, I want you to delete it, so.
Yeah, yeah.
We also have somebody eager to drop a line, just a short addition to that, perhaps.
My name's Chris Monshine. I work at Maastricht University at the European Center for Privacy and Cybersecurity. To the previous question, I think just to throw my hat into the ring, if you look at Article 17D of the GDPR, it refers you to Article 89, and there in Article 89 of the GDPR, you have this nice exception to certain rights, like the right to information or also the right to erasure. For, it says, public interest, scientific, historical research, statistical purposes, and so on. So if you go through
there are a
there
lot of
in
exceptions.
detail,
It's not like a strict.
Yeah.
You can regress erasure, and they should do it anyway. There's a lot of.
and then for Article 89, if you have a research or scientific project and you have to do this beforehand, but if you go through these steps and you document that and you put safeguards in place, you can deviate from this right to erasure in that case. But anyways, I wanted to also ask you guys some questions.
Thanks.
So
You have one. One question.
one question with two parts. Maybe.
Okay. It will be the last question.
Smart.
Yeah, regarding this whole onboarding through the terms of use that was explained, like my question would be, if you put out terms of use and say you can use your application, but you're not allowed to do X, Y, or Z, I see a problem there that we also see with Cambridge Analytica and so on. You can build these data markets or so, but who is then in a decentralized context accountable for things that go wrong, and how are these terms of use then enforced? Because I've heard about like the idea of having a stichting or a company form behind there to bundle liability, but then if it's only an empty husk, then I don't see the protection of personal data being affected in practice. And connected to that, if you look at the CNIL's opinion on blockchain, that I think they were the first data protection authority to put something out now, they say that, for instance, a user who can write something or send something to miners to implement in the blockchain, if this is personal data, then every user that has this power also becomes a controller. And then the question that I posed myself is, what do you do, for example, if you have to do a data protection impact assessment or you have compliance in general? Because if everyone's a user, you can't just do one DPIA and say to everyone, it's like, oh yeah, just copy paste that and have that somewhere in your drawer at home or so, to when the authorities come knocking or asking. So what would you think about that kind of situation?
Good luck.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more. That's, yeah. I think that's really hitting the pain points here. Yeah, of course, yeah.
That's why we're here.
Yeah. It's not really realistic that everyone is going to do a PIA. No. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add.
But if it's I think you mentioned the fact that the owner of the data is also the one in control, right? Did you make that link? Controller being the user, because this. Yeah. In that case, it's that's on the controller side. I think that's where the regulator has to come with something, because it's not a solution. You know, this is the pain point, using your words of the fact that the blockchain wasn't in their mind at that time. Okay. For sure, because if you have to in a way make rules to identify the controller with a technology where controllers can be distributed and not easy to be found.
Okay. But I also think this is up until this point pretty hypothetically, because typically, even if with a decentralized application, there's going to be an organization behind that that's going to be the beneficiary. So really, they're in the end, they're beneficiary of that, that application that's running there, that smart contract. So I wouldn't really, in that case, want to be that party. I think the errors are going to be pointed at them first.
Last follow-up question, because we have to.
I mean, in that case, but what if we come to this kind of Satoshi Nakamoto scenario where someone just pulls the trigger on a DApp or a solution and keeps him or herself anonymous and just doesn't follow up on it, but pushes it outside and it's adopted? That's,
definitely. So in that case, I think you're right, and it's going to be difficult to point at a specific entity. But
like
we really only see that with Bitcoin up until now. Even Ethereum, you can point at specific parties there.
Oh, that will be an interesting case, I think. So we have the last question.
Okay. Hello, my name is Bjorn Kryha. I represent Argosonic. I have a short question on territoriality. The GDPR discriminates between adequate and non-adequate countries, and specifically stipulates that you shall not pass data to non-adequate countries. But we have a global database, so to say, we have a global registry. What happens if a company provides a solution, thinks the data is anonymized, and then later, for example, by progress of technology, the data happens to be not anonymous anymore? Will you then be liable?
Yeah,
probably.
Yeah, for the period that it doesn't qualify as anonymized, I would say so.
I think you have to look at when so you can be fined for the next, let's say, 20 years, then the supercomputer comes and something happens. You're liable at that time.
Okay.
Yeah, well, whatever. I mean, in your case, you said, if later on something happens where computer can hack or the data is not anonymous anymore in there, and then the scenario would be the owner of the data says, oh, now I want to erase it. Wait a minute, it's not anonymous anymore. You cannot erase it anymore. Then you are in troubles. But that comes when if the data is still processed, and at that time, when the claim came, the technology was not able to anonymize anymore. And this is where a lot of solutions kind of they stumble upon this issue of like how far encryption can go. You can talk about post-computing, but we are also talking about a technology that goes far beyond what we are imagining. And that's what a regulator, when you come to them and say, like, this is anonymized for now, they would ask you, well, what about in 10 years? You're like, yeah, I think so, but I don't have the entire knowledge to know if it's anonymized or not. I hope I answered your question. So this is quite a hot topic.
It leaves a lot to our imagination, and I would like to close the Q&A with that, because as you can see, some people are already sharing drinks, and I would like to do the same with you. I want to thank you all for the great questions, and I want to thank Mariska, Ellen, Tobias, Daniel, Arnold, yeah, and Alessandro for all the answers, and looking forward to see you all at drinks.